Welcome to Late Night Calm. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go quiet. And let me take you somewhere very old and very far away. Somewhere lit by the low orange of a fire that has been burning all night. You do not have to remember anything. You do not have to follow every thread. You only have to let the words move through you like slow water. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is exactly as it should be. Imagine a market on a grey morning, more than 1,000 years ago, somewhere along a cold northern shore. The air smells of salt and tar and wood smoke, of wet wool and animal hide, and the faint sweetness of mead carried on someone's breath. There are stalls and there are blankets laid on the ground, and there are men crouched over their goods speaking in low voices. And here, in the middle of it all, a trader reaches to his belt, and from a small leather pouch he draws out something delicate, a folding balance, a tiny set of bronze scales, hinged so they can be carried closed and snapped open when there is business to be done. 2 little pans hang from fine arms, and beside them, in another pouch, sit a handful of small weights, dull metal, smooth from handling, each one made to mean a precise and agreed-upon amount. Now watch what he does, because this single small gesture holds the whole secret of the world we are about to climb through. He takes from his other hand a silver arm ring. A beautiful thing, twisted and bright, the kind of object you might imagine a person would treasure and wear and never part with. And he does not hand it over whole. Instead, he takes a tool and he cuts it. He chops the ring into pieces, snipping off a fragment then another, laying the bright shards into one pan of the balance while he sets his weights into the other, watching the little arms tip and settle, until the 2 sides hang level. When they balance, the price is met. The fragments change hands, and the rest of the ring, the unspent silver, goes back into his pouch to be cut again tomorrow for another deal in another place. This is money you can cut to size. Let that idea rest in your mind for a moment, because it is so unlike the way we think now. We carry coins and notes and numbers on a screen, fixed amounts that mean what they say. But for most of the Viking age, silver was not counted, it was weighed. A coin, an arm ring, a melted lump called an ingot, a brooch, a fine chain, a snipped corner of a foreign treasure, all of it was simply silver, and silver was worth whatever it weighed. Scholars have a word for this kind of arrangement. They call it a bullion economy, or sometimes by the old German term, Gewichtsgeld, weight money. It means the value lived not in the shape of the thing, but in its mass and its purity. A king's coin and a broken bracelet placed in the same pan of the same scale were worth precisely the same if they weighed the same. And so the most ordinary, most diagnostic object of this whole age is the one we have just watched being made. Hacksilver. Hacksilv in the old tongue. Silver deliberately cut and chopped and snipped into pieces to make up an exact weight for a transaction. When we dig up the buried wealth of these people, that is largely what we find. Not neat stacks of identical coins, but a jumble of fragments. Bent coins, half coins, the cut ends of arm rings, partial neck rings, little curls and slivers of bright metal, all hacked apart by people who needed not a ring, but a measured amount of the substance the ring was made from. Picture a hoard like that spilling from the ground after 1,000 years in the dark, and you can almost hear the small sound the snips made, one after another, in 100 forgotten marketplaces. Because the silver was weighed and not counted, people needed units to speak of it, agreed names for agreed amounts. They used a word, airea, which we might translate as an ounce, and the plural was ora. And 8 of these made a larger unit, a merk, a mark. These were not coins you could hold, they were weights, measures of silver, and they turn up again and again in the law codes that survive from this world. When the law set the price of a fine or the compensation owed for a wrong, it spoke in aura and marks. The whole machinery of justice and obligation ran on weighed silver, the same silver the trader was cutting in the market, the same silver a lord wore on his arm. And because the silver was the thing itself and not a coin guaranteed by anyone, people had to be careful. How do you know that the bright shard in the pan is solid silver all the way through and not some cheaper metal with a thin silver skin over it made to fool you? You test it. And the traders of this age had their ways. They would nick the surface with a blade or punch it with small marks, little dents pressed into the metal, to see whether the silver went deep or stopped at the surface. These marks have their own name now. We call them pecks, and the testing pecking, and you find these tiny punch marks scattered across coins from the trading shores, especially around the Irish Sea and the lands the Norse settled in England. Each little dent is a moment of caution, frozen in metal, a trader squinting in poor light, a quiet refusal to be cheated. Bends, too, where someone flexed a coin to feel whether it would crack like a fake or yield like the real thing. A whole grammar of suspicion written into the silver. So hold that picture, the folding scale, the chopped ring, the weighed fragments, the little testing marks. This is the engine of the world we are entering. And as we climb up through that world, level by level, from the lowest to the very highest, I want you to keep this engine humming quietly underneath everything. Because here is the surprising thing, the thread I will keep pulling on as you drift. Viking society is almost always told to us as a war story, a tale of fierce raiders and burning longships. But it is just as truly a silver story. And if you climb it as a silver story, rung by rung, 4 questions return at every single level, the same 4 questions, asked of the slave at the bottom and the king at the top. Here is the first. Do you own yourself? At the very bottom, the answer is no. You are owned, you are property, and the silver we have been weighing could be used to buy you or to buy your freedom. Higher up, the answer becomes yes, and stays yes, and the question turns to other things. Here is the second. Do you own land? For the great middle of this society, the free farmer, land was the ground of everything, the source of status and security and a voice in the world. To hold land was to be someone. Here is the third. Can you speak at the assembly? There was a gathering of free men, a place where law was spoken and disputes were settled and decisions were made, and the right to stand up there and be heard was one of the sharpest lines in the whole society. Some could speak. Some could only listen. Some were not welcome at all. And here is the fourth, the question that ties it all back to the scale and the chopped ring. How is your wealth measured and how is it shown? Because in this world, wealth was not a number in a ledger. It was weighed silver you could hold, and rings you could wear on your arms where everyone could see them, and hoards you could bury in the earth, and gifts you could give away in front of witnesses. Your silver, worn and weighed and given, was your standing made visible. It was, in a sense, your reputation you could touch. Do you own yourself? Do you own land? Can you speak at the assembly? How is your wealth measured and shown? Keep those 4 somewhere soft in your mind. We will ask them at every rung. Now, before we begin to climb, there is one more idea I want to lay down gently, because it dissolves a misunderstanding that gets in the way of seeing this world clearly. We tend to imagine the Vikings as a people, a nation of warriors who did nothing but raid. But the word itself does not quite mean that. To go Viking, Viking, was to go on an expedition, a seafaring venture. A Vikinger was a man doing a particular kind of work for a season. Viking, in other words, was closer to a job than to a bloodline. Most of the people in this world were not Vikings at all. They were farmers who stayed home and watched the barley grow, and the ones who did go out to sea did not divide neatly into peaceful merchants on one hand and violent raiders on the other. This is the thing that surprises people most, and it is worth saying slowly. It was a dual economy, a raiding and trading economy, woven from the same ships and the same crews, and very often the same men. Whether a venture turned to trade or to plunder depended on something quite practical. How strong was the place you arrived at? If the settlement on the shore was well defended, you put away your weapons and you opened your packs and you became a merchant, bargaining over furs and silver and slaves with that little folding scale on the blanket between you. If the place was weak, undefended, ripe, the same man with the same scale might draw a different tool entirely. The same crew that traded peacefully at one harbour in summer could take by force at another in spring. The merchant and the raider were not two kinds of people. They were one kind of person, reading the situation and choosing the more profitable face to show. And so when we climb through the levels of this society, we should not imagine a clean ladder of warriors. We should imagine a world of farmers and traders and slaves and lords, all bound together by weighed silver, where the line between the man who trades and the man who raids is just the line of which paid better that season, and where even the line between the free and the owned could, with enough silver and enough luck, be crossed. I want to pause here before we go down to the bottom rung and simply ask, where in the world are you listening from tonight? It is one of the quiet pleasures of these long nights for me to imagine the map of you scattered across so many time zones, so many dark windows and warm beds. If you feel like it, leave a note somewhere below telling me where you are, what corner of the world has gone dark around you. And if you are new here, if you have only just found this calm little place, you are very welcome to stay. There is a gentle way to make sure these slow stories keep finding you, but none of that is anything to do right now. Right now, there is only the fire and the voice and the long descent into another world. So let us go down, all the way down to the lowest rung of all. At the bottom of Viking society was the slave, and the old word for that slave was thrall. A man who was a thrall, a woman who was, in some uses, an ambat. And the hardest thing to understand, the thing that the law makes brutally plain, is that the thrall was not a person in the legal sense at all. The thrall was property, chattel, a thing that could be owned the way a horse or a cow or a plough could be owned. The law codes that survive from this world, the great Norwegian laws of the Gulathing and the Frostathing, and the Icelandic collection called Gragars, preserved this status with a chilling clarity. When a thrall was killed, it was not treated as murder. It was treated as damage to property. The compensation was paid not to the dead man's kin, as it would be for a free man, but to his owner, the way you might be paid for a broken tool or a slaughtered beast. The wrong was not against the thrall. The wrong was against the man who owned him. And remember the first of our 4 questions. Do you own yourself? For the thrall, the answer was simply no. He did not own himself. Someone else did. And the silver we watched being weighed in the market, that same silver could buy him, could set his price, could measure his life as a quantity of metal. It is hard, lying in the warm dark, to hold this in mind, but it belongs to the truth of the world, so let me say it plainly, and then let me carry you on. Slaves were one of the great commodities of the Viking economy. Human beings were among the most valuable things the Norse traded, and they traded them across an astonishing range of the world. The reach is almost difficult to believe. A person could be seized on the coast of Ireland or the shores of Britain, taken from a village along the Frankish coast, and carried away to be sold. And the routes did not only run westward and homeward, they ran east, far east, down the great rivers of what is now Russia, toward the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea into the markets of the Islamic world. A captive taken in the misty green of Ireland might end his journey in a market thousands of miles away, in the heat and the spice and the noise of the Caliphate's cities. From Dublin, in the end, toward Baghdad. Think of the length of that road, the months of it, and you begin to feel the dark scale of this trade. The peoples of the Islamic world had a word for the European slaves who arrived through these channels. They called them sakaliba, a term that pointed especially at Slavic and other European captives, and a great many of them reached the southern markets through Norse hands, through the traders and settlers in the east, whom we call the Russ. The Russes moved these captives along the river roads, and one of the great gathering points was a place called Bulgar, far up the Volga, a market where the goods of the north met the merchants of the south. Slaves flowed down toward Bulgar and beyond, and in return up those same rivers came the silver, the very dirhams, the Islamic silver coins that ended up in the pan of a trader's scale on a cold northern shore. So you see how the thread ties tight even here, even at the bottom. The silver that measured a free man's wealth was, in great part, bought with the bodies of the unfree. The two ends of the rope, the chopped arm ring in the market, and the captive carried toward Bulgar were the same rope. How did a person become a thrall? There was more than one road down. Some were born into it, for the child of a thrall was a thrall, inheriting the status the way a free child inherited land. Some were taken in raids and in war, seized from a homeland and never to see it again. Some were bought outright, sold from one owner to another, and some, and this is the part that should make us pause and look back up the ladder we are about to climb, some fell into slavery from above. A free person could be enslaved for debt that could not be paid, or as a punishment for certain crimes. The bottom rung was not sealed off from the rungs above it. A free farmer who owed silver he did not have could find himself sliding down into the very condition we are describing. The line between the free and the owned, which we might imagine as a wall, was in truth more like a slope, and a man could go down it. But if a man could fall, could a man also rise? And here, even at the very bottom, even in this hardest place, there is a thread of light, and it is a thread we will follow upward in the nights to come. The thrall's condition was not always for everyone forever. There were ways out. There was such a thing as being freed. There was even, in some circumstances, a way for a thrall to hold a little property of his own, to scrape together by some means a small store of value, and to use it perhaps to purchase his own freedom. It was constrained, it was hard, it was rare, but the door was not entirely shut. And the silver we have been weighing all along was the very thing that could, in the end, open it. The same metal that bought a man could also, in a thrall's careful hands over years, buy him back. So hold that small light and let it rest. The man sleeping at the far end of the longhouse, beyond the fire, beyond the animals warming the air with their breath, the man whose name the law would record only as so much property, was not necessarily fixed in that place for all his days. There was a ceremony, a thing called a freedom ale, that could one day be poured for him. There was a name, Lezingi, the freedman, that he might one day carry. The road up was long, and we will walk it slowly. But it existed. For now let the world go quiet around you. We have stood in the market and watched the silver chopped to size. We have learned the 4 questions we will carry up the ladder. Do you own yourself? Do you own land? Can you speak at the assembly? How is your wealth weighed and shown? We have seen that a Viking was less a kind of person than a kind of work, that the same man might trade in summer and raid in spring, his hand moving easily from the scale to the sword as the season and the strength of the harbour decided. And we have gone all the way down to the bottom, to the thrall, the owned one, carried along the long dark road from Dublin toward Baghdad, his price set in the same weighed silver that we will see in the nights ahead, worn by lords and buried by kings. We are standing now at the foot of the ladder, looking up. Above us are the free farmers, with their barley and their long houses, and above them the traders chasing silver down the eastern rivers, and the craftsmen who built the ships, and the jarls who broke their own rings to pay their men, and the kings who carved their power into standing stone. We will climb it all, slowly, in the quiet hours, rung by patient rung, but not yet. For now there is only the fire burning low, and the weighed silver glinting in the pan, and the long dark road stretching away toward the south. Let your breathing slow to match the slow turning of that world. There is nothing you need to carry up the ladder with you tonight. We will begin the climb in a little while, gently, the way everything here is done. Let us go back then to that market, because the scale deserves a longer look. It is a small thing the balancer trader carries, small enough to fold and hang from his belt beside his knife. 2 shallow pans of bronze, a beam between them, a set of weights kept in a little box or a pouch, weights of lead and of bronze, some of them faceted into neat 8-cornered cubes, others rounded into small barrels like beads. He sets it down on a flat stone or a plank, and he lets the beam settle until it hangs true, and only then does the buying and the selling begin. There is something almost devotional in it. A man does not haggle here with words alone. He haggles with metal and gravity, and the beam tells the truth that neither party can argue with. Now watch what passes across those pans. Not coins, not the way you would think of money, not a purse of identical stamped pieces counted out by number. What passes is silver in every shape it can take. A coin, yes, sometimes, an Arabic dirham worn smooth from travel, but beside it a fragment of a broken brooch, the curved end of an arm ring snipped clean through, a lump of melted ingot, a twist of wire. To this trader, they are all the same thing. They are silver, and silver is weighed, not counted. This is what the scholars call a bullion economy, a weight money economy, Gewichtsgeld in the old German term, and for most of these centuries it is how the Norse world moved its wealth. The face on the coin does not matter. The little picture, the foreign script, the name of some distant caliph, none of it buys you anything by itself. What buys you something is the weight of the metal and the purity of it, and so a coin and a chopped piece of jewelry sit in the same pan and mean the same thing. This is why, if you reached into a Viking hoard and let the silver run through your fingers, you would not find a tidy stack of money. You would find a strange and broken treasure, coins bent double, coins cut into halves and quarters, rings that have had pieces taken out of them, ingots snapped like bread. This broken silver has a name. Hack silver, hacksolv, hacked silver, silver that has been chopped to make up a weight. It is the most ordinary thing in the world to these people, and it is the single clearest fingerprint of how their economy worked. A man wants to buy something that costs, let us say, a certain weight of silver. He does not have a coin of exactly that weight because there is no such coin, because weight is the only thing that counts. So he takes whatever silver he has, an arm ring perhaps, and he lays it in one pan, and he chops a piece off it and chops again, smaller, smaller, watching the beam until the 2 pans hang level and the bargain is made. The arm ring that was an ornament on his wrist in the morning is a handful of weighed fragments by the afternoon. Money you cut to size. And there are units for it, names the law codes themselves use when they set the price of a fine or the worth of a man's life. The area, the ounce, and above it, the merk, the mark, which is 8 of those ounces together. when the old laws tell you what you owe for an injury or what compensation a killing demands, they speak in these weights of silver. So the scale is not only a merchant's tool, it is, in a quiet way, the instrument of justice as well. The same beam that decides whether a bargain is fair could, in principle, weigh out the silver that settles a feud. But before any of that silver changes hands, there is a smaller, more suspicious gesture you would see again and again, and once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. A trader takes a coin or a fragment offered to him, and he does not simply weigh it. First, he tests it. He nicks it with a knife, a small, bright cut into the surface. He presses a tiny punch into it, leaving a little pock, a peck, and so this practice has earned its own plain name, pecking. Or he bends the piece a little to feel whether it gives the way good silver gives. He is checking that the metal is solid silver all the way through, that it is not some base lump wearing a thin coat of silver on its skin. Look closely at the coins from the Danelaw, from the Irish Sea World, and you will find them peppered with these little marks, each one a moment of doubt made permanent, each one a small record of a stranger who did not quite trust what he was handed and made sure before the beam ever settled. Trust, in this world, was a thing you carved into the metal with the point of a knife. So we have our 4 questions, the 4 we will carry up every rung of the ladder in the nights to come. Do you own yourself? Do you own land? Can you speak at the thing, the assembly of free men? And how is your wealth weighed and shown? Hold them gently. They are the rungs themselves in a way, because the answers change as we climb, and the changing of the answers is the whole shape of this society. At the very bottom, the owned one cannot answer yes to any of them. Near the top, the Lord and the King answer yes to all 4 and then some. Everyone else lives in between, climbing or slipping, freeing themselves slowly or falling slowly into debt, and the scale and the silver follow them the whole way up and down. And here is the thing about the man who carries that folding scale, the trader himself, that we should sit with for a moment before we go any further down. Do not picture him as a separate kind of person, a merchant in one corner of the world and a warrior in another. That is not how it worked. The word we have inherited for these people, Viking, did not mean a race or a tribe or a nation. It meant, more nearly, an activity, a thing you did. To go Viking was to go on a raiding voyage, a seafaring expedition, the way you might go to sea or go to war. A man was not a Viking the way he was a Dane or a Norwegian. He was on a Viking, in season, when it suited him. The rest of the year he was something else entirely. A farmer most often bent over his barley and his sheep like nearly everyone around him. And so the same hands that worked that scale in summer might have held a different tool in spring. This is the part that reshapes the whole picture once you let it settle. It was a dual economy, raiding and trading, braided together so tightly you could not always pull them apart, and often it was the very same ships, the very same crews, the very same men doing both. The deciding factor was simple and cold. How strong was the harbour you sailed into? If the place was rich and well defended, you traded, you laid out your furs and your silver and your weighed bargains and behaved like an honest merchant because that was the profitable thing to do. If the place was rich and poorly defended, the scales stayed in the pouch and the other tools came out. The same man, the same season turning, the hand moving easily from the balance to the blade and back again as the strength of the shore decided. Trade when trading paid, raid when raiding paid. There was no contradiction in it that they would have recognized, no line drawn between the merchant and the raider that meant anything once you were out on the grey water with a crew to feed and a season to use. If you are settling into this slow journey for the first time tonight, lay your head down wherever you are in the world and tell me in the comments below where in the world you are listening from. I read them, all of them, the names of far places gathered up quietly, the way silver was once gathered into a single hole in the ground. And if you would like more of these long, slow walks through the old world, the kind you can drift off inside, then stay a while, subscribe, and let the channel keep them coming. Now come down with me all the way down to the bottom of the ladder, because that is where every honest climb has to begin. At the foot of it stands the Thrall, the owned one, and if the owned one was a woman, the word was ambat. To this society, the thrall was not a person at all in the way the law cared about persons. The thrall was chattel, property, livestock that could speak. The old law codes that come down to us are unsparing on the point, treating the killing of a thrall not as murder at all, but as damage to property, a loss the owner must be paid for, the way you would be paid for a slaughtered ox. And the thralls of the Norse world were not only kept, they were a commodity, one of the great commodities, bought and sold and carried along the trade roads in their thousands. A man taken in a raid on the Irish coast might be sold in Dublin and passed eastward hand to hand, traded down the long rivers until he stood for sale in a market far to the south, in the world of the Caliphate, where the Arabic word for such European slaves was sakaliba. Down those eastern rivers the Russes carried them to the great slave markets that fed Bulgar on the Volga, and on, further south still, into lands the captive could not have imagined when he was first taken from his home. The silver flowed north into the Viking world. And one of the things that brought it, flowing the other way, weighed on the very scales we have been watching, was people. Think for a moment about what it meant to be acquired. Not to acquire, not to stride up a beach with a sword and choose what you wanted to take, but to be the thing chosen, to be lifted out of your life with no more ceremony than a cask of grain hoisted onto a ship. The routes were several, and the law was particular about each of them, because the Norse were careful people in this as in all economic matters, and the legal status of a thrall depended partly on how he or she had come to be one. The most obvious route was capture. A raid landed on a coast, moved inland quickly, took what was portable, and among the portable things always were people. Men who could row and carry. Women who could work and weave, and whose children would be born thralls in their turn, because that was the other route, birth. If your mother was a thrall, you were a thrall from the first breath you drew in the longhouse, regardless of who your father was. The law saw to that cleanly. There was no ambiguity in it, no soft exception for a child who happened to be born with a certain look or a certain cleverness. The condition followed the mother, and it followed without sentiment. And then there was the third route, the one that the free farmer dreaded perhaps more than the raid, because the raid was something that happened to other people on other coasts. The third route was debt. A man who could not pay what he owed could, under certain circumstances encoded in the old Norwegian laws and the Icelandic gragas, find himself sliding from the category of free to the category of owned. Not swiftly, not easily, and always with legal formality around it, because the Norse were formalists in this, but the slide was possible, and that possibility, however remote, was a shadow that fell across the world of the free farmer whenever times were hard and the harvest thin. Freedom was not a permanent condition that came with being born Norse and born free. It was a legal status that could, in principle, be lost. So the thrall stood at the bottom of everything. And the Norse, being the kind of people who liked their world explained to them in story as well as law, had a myth for it. The poem called the Rigstula, the Lay of Rig, tells of the god Rig, who moves through the world and beds 3 women in 3 different households. The first household is poor and dark, the bed cold and the bread heavy and coarse, and from that union is born a son called Thrall, dark-skinned, and thick-fingered in the poem's telling, given to hard labor and heavy loads. The second household is a farm, decent and warm, and from that union comes Karl, the free man, ruddy and capable, learning to manage cattle and work the land. The third household is the finest, the linens white, the table set, and from that union comes Jarl, the nobleman, fair and keen-eyed, destined for weapons and horses and command. The poem is not a census, it is a myth, which means it tells you less about the reality of Viking society and more about how that society understood itself, how it explained the differences between people and made them feel, if not exactly just, then at least cosmically arranged. But what the myth does not tell you, what myths rarely do, is how a person might move between those categories. Because movement was possible. Slow, constrained, requiring generations in some directions, but possible. And that possibility is where the real texture of the bottom rung begins to emerge, because a world with no movement at all is a world that looks different from one where a man might, on the right day, with the right accumulation of small fortunes, drink the cup that changed what he was. The man called Ibn Fadlan understood something about the human cost of all this commerce, and he left us the most vivid account we have of the Rus's traders who moved these goods and these people along the eastern rivers. He was an Arab envoy sent out in the year 921 on a diplomatic mission toward the lands of the Volga Bulgars, and what he found along the way was a world he had not been prepared for. The Rus he met were large men, he wrote, broad and ruddy, their bodies covered in tattoos of dark blue, trees and figures running from their fingernails to their necks. They were camped on the riverbank with their trade goods, and among those goods were the slave girls they had brought down from the north to sell in the markets of the south. He described the traders frankly as a man who was trying to understand something foreign and did not quite manage to admire it. And when the chief of these Rus died during the journey, Ibn Fadlan stayed to watch what happened. What happened was elaborate and terrible and deeply ceremonial. The dead man's possessions were gathered and divided, a portion kept, a portion burned. A ship was drawn up on the bank. The man's body was laid inside it, and a slave girl volunteered or was designated, the account is not entirely clear, and scholars have been careful about the exact nature of her choice, to accompany her master into whatever came next. There were rituals over several days. There was drinking. There was a ceremony involving the men of the camp. And then the girl was placed on the ship beside her dead master, and the ship was set alight. Ibn Fadlan watched it burn. He was bewildered by what he saw, and honest enough to say so. And we should be careful with his account because he was describing the Rus from the outside in a single place and a single moment, and what he witnessed was probably a high-status exception rather than an everyday funeral. The extraordinary send-off of a leader, not the routine death of a farmer. But the account is real, the witness is genuine, and it tells us something that the law codes tell us in colder, drier terms, that a thrall's life was, in certain circumstances, understood to belong entirely to someone else. Not merely their labor, their life. The archaeology has added its own quieter witness to this. At Flakstad, in Norway, a burial was excavated that contained 2 bodies, and the study of their bones told a complicated story. Analysis of the isotopes preserved in their teeth and skeletons, the chemical signatures left by the food and water a person consumed in childhood, which vary by geography and can tell you where someone grew up, suggested that the 2 individuals had different origins, different early lives, different trajectories that had brought them to the same hole in the same ground. One of the bodies showed signs consistent with a violent end. The interpretation, offered with appropriate caution because interpretation is never certainty in archaeology, is that the lower status individual may have been killed to accompany the other into death. The evidence does not shout, it whispers. But it whispers in the same direction as Ibn Fadlan's careful, horrified account. And so the world of the Thrall was bounded on all sides. Below you was nothing, no lower category, no one whose existence was more constrained than yours. Above you was everyone else, and the first small ledge above you was the possibility of the cup. The Frelsesøl was the freedom ale, and it was exactly what it sounds like. The manumission of a thrall, the formal legal act of freeing an owned person, was marked in the old Norwegian laws by a ceremony centered on drinking, because the Norse marked important transitions with feasting and drink, and this was one of the most important transitions the law recognized. The owner, in freeing a thrall, was performing a legal act with social and economic consequences, not merely a personal kindness, and it required the weight of witnesses and ritual to make it real in the world. But freedom, in the Norse legal scheme, was not a single step. It was a staircase that took generations to climb. The word for a freed slave was leisingi. Freedman, and the leisingi was not, upon drinking that freedom ale, suddenly the equal of the man who had freed him. He was free in the sense that he could not be sold, that his death was no longer merely property damage, but something the law had to reckon with differently. But he remained in a web of obligation and dependency that tied him to his former owner's family. The Gulathing law and the Frostathing law, those old Norwegian codes, were specific about this. The freedman owed duties to the family that had freed him, and if he died without his own heirs, his estate might revert to them. Full legal independence, the kind that let a man stand at the assembly and speak without the shadow of dependency on him, could take several generations. His children, born free, would stand closer to full freedom than he did. His grandchildren might finally arrive. This was the Norse conception of freedom as a social position that had to be grown into rather than simply granted. It reflected the same underlying logic as the silver economy. That value was accumulated gradually, weighed, measured, built up over time into something substantial. Freedom had a weight, and you had to earn it in increments. But let us say the climb has happened, let us say the generations have passed, or that a man was born free and has always been free, and now he wakes in the morning, that is every morning, in the building that is the world most Norse people actually inhabited. He is a carl, or by the other word, the one used more often in the law codes, a bondi, a farmer, a free man of the land. He wakes in a longhouse, and before we go further, it is worth sitting in that building for a moment, because it explains a great deal about the world it contained. The Norse longhouse, the bear, was not a house in the sense we mean when we say house, a structure dedicated to human habitation, and human habitation alone, divided into rooms by walls, private and partitioned. It was a long building, sometimes 30 meters from end to end, sometimes more, with a single great central space and smaller divisions at the ends, and it held under one roof the things that could not afford to be separated: the family, the dependents, any thralls who served the household. The cattle and the sheep and perhaps the horses penned at one end, sharing the warmth of their bodies with the humans at the other end through the winter, when warmth was not decorative but necessary for survival. The roof was low, and the smoke from the central hearth rose slowly to find the smoke holes above, and in winter the light inside was dim and orange, and the smell was hay and cattle and wood smoke and human life, all pressed together into something that was not unpleasant once you were used to it, or so we must assume, because generation after generation was born and lived and died in exactly these conditions. The excavated longhouses at Stong in Iceland, at Hofstaddir, at dozens of sites across Scandinavia and the Atlantic settlements, Give us the bones of these buildings, and what they show is a world in which the division between the human and the animal, the public and the private, was much thinner than we are used to. You slept in proximity. You heard the breathing of cattle through the night. The carl who woke in this building had work in front of him, and the work was farming. This is the fact that the popular image of the Viking world consistently underplays and occasionally omits entirely. The vast majority of Norse people never sailed on a raid, never stood on a foreign beach with a weapon in their hands. The raids were real, and the men who went on them left marks on the historical record that are completely disproportionate to their numbers, because violence at a distance is memorable and farming at home is not. But behind every long ship that left a harbour there were dozens of farms, hundreds of people doing the slow and unglamorous work that kept the entire economy alive. Barley and oats and rye planted in spring and watched through summer and harvested before the rains came. Cattle that needed to be managed through the whole cycle of the year. Sheep for wool, which was not decorative, but functional in a way that connected directly to the world of ships and silver, as we will come to. Goats and pigs and horses. Fish, when the season allowed it, salted and dried for the long winter. This was the life of the bondi, the free farmer, and it was a life lived close to the margin of sufficiency, not necessarily in want, but never far from the possibility of want, because the Norse climate was cold and the growing season short, and a bad harvest had consequences that ran through the following year, and perhaps the year after that. The carl who managed his land well, who built his herds carefully and kept his thralls and dependents fed and useful, was a man of substance. Not wealthy in the way a jarl was wealthy, not able to command the loyalty of warriors or feast a hall full of armed men, but substantial, rooted. And rootedness in the Norse world was not a small thing. It was the foundation of everything else that mattered legally and socially. Because the freeman's most important possession, more important in many ways than his animals or his tools or the silver he might accumulate through trade, was his legal personhood, his status as a man whose life had a price. The word for that price was vergild, from the old Germanic roots meaning simply man price, the compensation owed to a free man's kin if he was killed or seriously harmed. In the Norse laws it was mangjald or man payment, and it was the fundamental legal expression of the difference between a free person and a thrall. When a thrall was killed, the compensation went to his owner because the owner had lost property. The death was recorded and compensated as you would compensate someone for a dead ox. But when a free man was killed, when a carl died by violence, his kin were owed the full vergild, a payment that reflected his status in the community, his rank within the hierarchy of free people. The law codes were very specific about how this worked. The Gulathing law, that great body of Norwegian customary law that was eventually written down in the medieval period, and the Icelandic Gragas, the Grey Goose laws, Iceland's own legal code, both contain careful schedules of payment. A man's life was worth so many ounces of silver, where an ounce of silver was the area, and 8 ora made a merk, a mark. And these weight units were not merely legal abstractions. They were the same units used to weigh the silver at the market, the same units that appeared on the little weights carried in the trader's pouch. The law and the marketplace spoke the same language, and that language was silver by weight. This matters more than it might first appear. It means that the entire social order, the hierarchy of free men, the gradations of rank, the compensation owed for injury or death, was expressed in the same currency as the economy. Your life was literally priced in the same silver that a trader used to buy furs on the Russian rivers or to pay for a cargo of salt at Hedeby. The abstract dignity of your legal personhood and the concrete practicality of a market transaction were made of the same stuff, measured on the same scales. And so when the Carl stood in his longhouse and understood what it meant to be free, part of what he understood was that his life had weight, the same kind of weight that could be balanced on the little bronze arms of a folding scale. The thrall had no such weight of his own. His death was damage, not loss. And that distinction between a loss that belonged to you and a loss that belonged to your owner was the deepest line the Norse world drew through human society. The free farmer's legal personhood expressed itself in other ways too, ways that were not about death and compensation, but about participation in the life of the community while he was still alive. The most important of these was the assembly, the thing. But we will come to that in full when the climb takes us higher, because the thing was more fully the world of the Jarl and the Godi than of the modest Bondi, though the Bondi had his rights there too, his voice, his vote, his standing. For now, let it be enough to say that the free man could speak, the thrall could not. That difference mattered every day, in ways large and small, in disputes over land and inheritance and injury that had to be settled publicly before witnesses. The free man also, in principle, bore arms. The Norse expected free men to be capable of violence in their own defense and in the defense of their community, and the weapons, an axe, a seax, a spear, were part of the practical equipment of a free household. They were not decorative. A farm in a world without reliable centralized law enforcement needed to be capable of protecting itself. And so the Carl was not merely a farmer in the sense of being a civilian, he was a free-armed man, and his arms were an expression of his status as surely as his wergild was. But within the category of free, within the broad and populous world of the Carl, there were gradations. Not all Bender were equal. A man who owned his land outright, who had inherited a good farm and built it carefully, who kept a few thralls and had grown his herds over years, was not the same as the man who rented his land from a jarl who had no thralls and barely enough animals to get through a hard winter. Both were technically free. Both could speak at the assembly. Both had a wergild, but one of them had more silver, more land, more dependence, and more of what the Norse would have understood as weight in the world. And silver, for the Carl who accumulated any at all, was kept and used in the way the whole Norse world kept and used it. As hack silver, as broken pieces, as fragments of arm rings and snipped corners of coins, weighed when needed on the little scales that a man with serious business to conduct carried with him to the market. We will return to those scales in depth when the climb takes us to the trader-raider, because that is where the silver economy reveals itself most completely, in the dust transaction of the market towns. But even the modest farmer who made it to the spring fair at one of the smaller trading places carried his silver by weight, knew his area, could read a scale well enough to protect himself from being cheated. The free woman in this world occupied a position that was constrained in some directions and notably broad in others for the period and the place. She could not, in general, speak at the assembly in her own right or hold the formal political and legal offices that the assembly governed. In that sense, her exclusion from full political personhood mirrored the thrall's exclusion from legal personhood, though of course the two were vastly different in every other respect. But the free woman could own property, she could inherit in defined circumstances, she could manage the farm and the household in her husband's absence, which in the world of the Viking age meant managing it for months at a time, perhaps years, while men sailed away on trade voyages or raids or military service. The symbol of her authority in those circumstances was the set of keys she wore at her belt, hanging from the great oval brooches that pinned her cloak at the shoulders. Those keys opened the storerooms and the chests that held the household supplies and valuables. They were not decorative, they were a statement of functional authority, made in iron, worn on the body. The graves of free Norse women frequently contain these brooches and these keys, and when you look at them in the cases of a museum now, What you are seeing is the material expression of a carefully bounded but real power, the power to run a complex household economy across a long winter, to make decisions about when to slaughter animals and when to preserve them, when to open the grain store and when to close it tight. And the free woman, under the old laws, could initiate divorce. This distinguishes the Norse legal world from much of what surrounded it in the early medieval period. She could not do everything a free man could do, but she was not without recourse when a marriage became intolerable. All of this, the longhouse and the farm, the vergild and the eyrie, the keys at the belt and the voice at the assembly, was the world of the carl and the bondi. The backbone, the broad base that supported everything above it. Without the farming economy, there was no surplus, and without surplus there was nothing to trade, nothing to raid for, nothing to gift, nothing to weigh. The jarls and the kings lived on top of this broad base of agricultural labour, and they could not have existed without it. But the carl's world was also not the whole world of the free Norse man, because some of those free men had ships, or the money to buy a place on one. And when they did, the world opened in directions that are difficult to convey from the inside of a long house on a grey winter morning. The trader-raider is the next rung of the ladder, and to understand him you have to understand the strange duality at the heart of the Norse economy, not as a contradiction, but as a perfectly rational response to a world where profit came in two forms and the same vehicle served both. The word Viking, Vikingur in the Old Norse, names an activity rather than a people. To go a Viking was to go on a seafaring expedition that might involve trade, might involve raid, or might involve both in the same season, depending on what you found when you arrived somewhere. The man who left his Norwegian farm in spring and sailed west was not necessarily committed to violence or committed to commerce. He was committed to profit, and he would find it in whichever form the situation offered. A coast with no defences and goods worth taking was a target. A market town with established rules and protections where you could sell your furs and your amber and your walrus ivory and buy wine and silver and cloth was a trading partner. The ships that carried warriors could carry cargo. The men who knew how to fight could negotiate. The line between the two activities was not moral, but practical, and it shifted with the relative strength of the people you met on the other end of the voyage. This is the delta at the heart of what the Viking Age actually was, the thing that the image of the fierce warrior consistently misses. It was an economy organized around mobile, portable wealth, silver above all, and the Norse were extraordinarily good at moving that wealth, extracting it, accumulating it, and bringing it home. Violence was one method, trade was another, and a great deal of the time the two were combined in the same expedition by the same people in the same season. The market towns that grew up to handle this commerce were places of remarkable density and complexity. Hedeby, sitting near the base of the Jutland Peninsula at the boundary between what is now Denmark and Germany, was one of the great ones, an international emporium where ships from many directions converged on a protected harbour and a busy marketplace. Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, served the eastern and northern trade networks. Kaupang, on the western shore of the Oslofjord in Norway, was a seasonal trading place for the Norwegian coast and the North Sea routes. Ribe in Denmark is among the earliest of them, a place where silver and trade goods moved through even before the Viking Age proper had begun. These were not villages. They were proto-cities with specialist craftsmen clustered in workshop districts, with weighing stations and markets, with populations drawn from many different places who could communicate well enough to do business because business has always found its own language. At Hedeby and Birka, the archaeologists have found the traces of workshops where antler and bone were turned into combs, a utilitarian object that was also a small luxury and travelled well as trade goods. Where amber was shaped and smoothed, where glass beads were made in colors that could not be produced locally, where iron was worked and bronze was cast. These craftsmen were not farmers. They were specialists in a division of labor that only the density of a trading town makes possible, because only a trading town generates enough varied demand to support a man who does nothing but make combs or nothing but work bronze all year long. And threading through all of it, the reason the whole system worked was the silver. We will follow that silver properly in the next part of this journey, up the eastern rivers with the Rus, all the way to the Islamic world that sent the dirhams flowing north, and then back west to the English coasts, where the Danegeld piled up in quantities that still stagger when you read the numbers. But for now, let it be said that the trader-raider chasing silver was doing something that looks, from a certain angle, like simple greed, and from another angle, like a sophisticated and coherent economic strategy in a world without banks, without reliable coinage, without credit in any institutional sense. Silver, portable and weighable and universally valued, was the closest thing to money that this world had, and the men who moved it were the arteries of an economy that stretched from the Norwegian coast to the Caspian Sea and back. The Carl who made it into that world, who found a place on a ship and a share in the profits of a voyage, had stepped onto a rung of the ladder that was neither the slow dignity of the farming life nor the ceremonial magnificence of the Jarl's Hall, but something in between, something mobile and risky and potentially transformative. A successful trading season could change a man's position in the world. A successful raid could change it faster. The silver he brought home, weighed out in the folding scale and divided according to agreements made before the voyage, was not just wealth, it was a reclassification. A man who returned with enough of it could buy land, could free a thrall or two, could begin the slow process of building the kind of household that commanded respect at the assembly. The climb was never guaranteed. Ships sank, raids went wrong, trading partners turned hostile. The eastern rivers were dangerous in ways that went beyond weather. There were rapids on the Dnieper that had to be portaged, stretches of open steppe where enemies waited, and the journey to the markets of the Caliphate and back was not a single season's work, but an enterprise measured in years. Men died on the way and never came home to spend what they had accumulated. The rune stones that still stand in the Swedish countryside, carved with the names of men who went east and never returned, are a reminder that the silver economy had a human cost that the hoards do not show. But the hoard itself, that fundamental unit of Viking wealth, silver pressed into the ground in a moment of danger or uncertainty, is where the story of the Carl and the trader and the whole ascending hierarchy of Norse society ultimately arrives. Because every man on every rung of the ladder, from the freed thrall learning what it was to be a Leysingi to the Jarl weighing his ring hoard in the quiet of his hall, lived in the same relationship to silver. They all weighed it, they all cut it, they all sometimes buried it, and the ones who buried it sometimes did not come back to dig it up. That silence, the silence of the silver in the ground, waiting for an owner who never returned, is where the next part of this descent begins. The emporia were the hinge points of the whole system. Not villages in the way you might imagine a village, not clusters of longhouses around a church or a well, growing slowly over generations from a handful of families. The great trading towns of the Viking world were something different, deliberately planned, sometimes deliberately enclosed, places where the dual economy of the Norse world came to rest for a season before moving on. Hedeby sat at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, in the narrow neck of land where Denmark meets what is now Germany, and it was chosen for exactly that reason. It lay on the shortest overland crossing between the North Sea and the Baltic, a portage of a few miles that allowed merchants to avoid the long and dangerous sail around the top of Jutland. Goods moved in from both coasts and met in the middle. The town that grew up around that crossing was, in its heyday, one of the largest settlements in northern Europe, defended by a great semicircular rampart and home to workshops, warehouses, wells and jetties where ships lay alongside in the dark water. Walk through Hedeby in the early 10th century, and the excavations have given us enough to do this, at least in outline. And what you encounter is not a quiet agricultural settlement, but a dense, loud, smelling of smoke and tallow working town. Whole streets were given over to particular craft. Blacksmiths worked iron in the glow of their forge fires. Comb makers sat at their benches with antler and bone, cutting the fine-toothed combs that were a basic item of Norse grooming and therefore a commodity with reliable demand across the trade routes. Glass bead makers worked small furnaces, rolling molten glass into the bright-coloured beads that have turned up in graves and middens from Ireland to the Russian rivers. Leatherworkers, amber polishers, bronze casters and weavers all occupied their own corners of the town. The same picture holds at Birka, on its island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden, and at Kaupang on the western shore of the Oslofjord in Norway, and at Ribe in western Denmark, which is among the earliest of the Norse market centres and already active by the early 8th century. These were not places where you went to live a quiet life. They were places where you went to convert things into silver and silver back into things. The furs and slaves and ivory that came south and west from the Norse homelands and from the peoples the Norse traded with and raided, the Sami in the north, the Slavic peoples to the east, the Irish and English and Franks to the west, passed through these emporia on their way to the markets that would pay for them, and in return came everything that silver could buy: fine cloth, wine, glass, spices, finished metalwork, and above all the silver itself in the form of coins and ingots and arm rings, to be weighed on the portable bronze balances that every serious trader carried and that archaeologists find in their hundreds across the sites. Birka's graves tell this story with particular vividness. The dead buried there include traders with sets of balance pan scales folded inside their belts, alongside the lead or bronze weights that they used to measure silver on the spot at any transaction. They include men and women with imported textiles on their bodies, silk woven in Constantinople or further east, fine wool from the Rhineland, and with glass beads from the workshops of the Islamic world lying around their necks. The ordinary dead of Birka were extraordinarily connected to the world. A person buried on that Swedish island in the 9th century might have worn silk from Byzantium and carried coins minted in what is now Uzbekistan, all in the course of a life lived entirely within a few weeks' sailing of their birthplace. The routes that made this possible ran in two great directions, and they were not the routes most people think of when they think of Viking travel. The western routes, to England, Ireland, Francia, and eventually to the Atlantic, are the ones that filled the chronicles and the monasteries' accounts of destruction. But the eastern routes were, in terms of the sheer volume of silver they moved, arguably more important to the Norse economy during the height of the Viking Age. And the eastern routes went deep. They went further than anyone living in an English monastery could easily have imagined. The Rus were the Norse who moved into the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, establishing themselves at key points along the waterways, at Novgorod, at Kiev, at Smolensk and Nezdovo and a dozen other places, as traders and rulers and intermediaries between the forests of the north and the wealthy civilizations of the south. They used the rivers as highways in a way that only becomes comprehensible when you look at a map and trace the extraordinary branching network of waterways connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian. From the Baltic, you could enter the Gulf of Finland and row up the Neva to Lake Ladoga. From there, the river Volkhov led south to Novgorod, and beyond Novgorod the system continued through Smolensk and down the Dnieper to Kiev, and eventually to the Black Sea and Constantinople, the Miklagard, the great city, what the Norse called it, meaning the great enclosure or the great city, a name that gives you something of the awe in which it was held. Or you could branch eastward from the upper Volga and descend all the way to the Caspian Sea, and from the Caspian into the markets of the Islamic world. Down these rivers, in the summer months when the water was navigable, went the cargo that the Norse and their Slavic trading partners had accumulated through the long winter months of the northern interior. Furs above all, the pelts of beaver and sable, marten and squirrel, which the Frankish and Byzantine and Islamic aristocracies consumed in enormous quantities as markers of status and warmth in a world without central heating. Honey and beeswax, which were valuable commodities for everything from candles to preserving food to the production of mead. Amber from the Baltic shores, which had been a trade good moving south from the same coastlines since the Bronze Age, and which never lost its value. And slaves, human beings primarily captured in raids into the Slavic lands to the east and west, or purchased from other Norse traders who had gathered them on the western raids, moving south in the ships as both cargo and an investment in silver. The Arabic geographers who wrote about these routes from the Islamic side described the Russes' traders with a mixture of fascination and disdain. They were big men, the accounts say. They carried swords always. They were wealthy in the sense of carrying portable wealth on their bodies. And they brought to the markets of the Caliphate the things that the Caliphate wanted and could not easily obtain for itself: the furs and the slaves and the luxury goods of the northern forests, in exchange for the thing the Norse wanted above all else: silver. The silver came in the form of the dirham, the coin of the Abbasid Caliphate and its successors, and the Central Asian states that traded with it. The dirham was a small silver coin, well made, often beautifully inscribed with Quranic text, and the name of the caliph or the issuing authority, and minted in quantities that by the 9th and 10th centuries were flooding north up the river routes in a torrent that has left its mark in the ground across an enormous arc from Sweden to Finland to the Baltic shores to Poland and into Scandinavia itself. When you dig up a Viking Age hoard in Gotland today, and Gotland, the large Swedish island in the Baltic that served as a great redistribution hub for the Eastern trade, has produced more Viking silver hoards than any comparable area on Earth. You are not digging up Scandinavian silver, you are digging up the silver economy of the Islamic world, transplanted north by the river trade. The island of Gotland alone has yielded more than 700 separate silver hoards from the Viking Age. 700 holes in the ground where someone buried their wealth in one corner of one island and walked away, or did not walk away, could not walk away, and the silver stayed. The coins in those hoards were minted in places that had no idea that Gotland existed: Samarkand, now in Uzbekistan; Tashkent, the great mints of the Abbasid heartland in what is now Iraq; the mints of the Samanid dynasty in Central Asia; silver that began its journey thousands of miles to the southeast, pressed into small circular discs by the authority of a caliph or a regional ruler, changing hands through the networks of Islamic trade, arriving eventually at the markets on the Volga, at the great emporium of Bulgar, where Norse and Russi's traders met the merchants coming up from the south, and there exchanged for furs and amber and human beings, and then moving north again, up the rivers, over the portages, and into the ground on a Baltic island where it stayed for 1,000 years until a farmer's plough or a metal detector found it. A dirham on a Norwegian farm. A coin minted in Samarkand, arriving in the hand of a bondi who had perhaps never travelled more than a few days' walk from the place where he was born, reaching him through the chains of trade and exchange that connected his world to the whole of the known world from one end to the other. This is what the silver economy of the Viking Age actually was, not a local system of barter between neighbors, but a genuinely global circulation of portable wealth, running along the arteries of the river routes and the sea lanes, and pooling wherever a Norse trader set down his folding balance and began to weigh. The peak of the dirham inflow was roughly the 9th and 10th centuries, and then, sometime in the later 10th century, it slowed, and in some decades nearly stopped. The reasons were complex, partly a depletion of the great silver mines of the Samarkand state in Central Asia that had been feeding the mints, partly disruptions in the political landscape of the Islamic world that interrupted the trade routes, partly the general instability of the late 10th century in the eastern steppe regions. The Norse and the Rus did not simply stop needing silver, they turned in a different direction. They turned west. The silver of the West came from two main sources: German silver, minted into the so-called Otto Adelheid pennies, and the coins of the Ottonian rulers of the Holy Roman Empire began moving north along the Baltic and North Sea trade routes. And English silver, vast, almost incomprehensible quantities of English silver, began moving north in a different way entirely, not as the quiet accumulation of trade, but as tribute, extracted by force and the threat of force from the English crown. Danegeld was what the English called it, and the name has persisted because the thing it describes was so distinctive, so large in scale, and so systematically repeated, that it lodged in the collective memory of the people who had to pay it. It was tribute. The Norse armies that began operating in England in the late 10th century were not simply raiding in the old quick-strike style, descend on a coast, take what you can carry, row away before the local levy can respond. They were operating as armies of occupation, camping in English territory through the winter, raiding inland, and making it known that they would leave and stop burning if enough silver was paid. The English paid, and paid again. And the amounts grew with each iteration, as the Norse commanders learned how much England could be made to yield. 10,000 pounds of silver in 991, paid after the Battle of Maldon, when the Norse force led by the man the sources call Anlaf, most likely Olaf Tryggvason, defeated the English defenders and camped on the Essex coast, demanding satisfaction. 16,000 pounds in 994, 24,000 in 1002, 36,000 in 1007, 48,000 pounds of silver, 48,000 in 1012, extracted by the army of Thorkel the Tall after a siege of Canterbury and the capture and killing of the Archbishop. These are not estimates. These numbers are recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, set down by people who lived through the payments and saw the silver going out. 48,000 pounds of silver. To translate that into something your body can feel, a pound of silver is roughly the weight of a large apple. Now imagine 48,000 apples made of silver. That is what England paid out in a single transaction in 1012 in exchange for a Norse army leaving, or at least leaving for that season, with no guarantee it would not return. And Knut, who became King of England in 1016 and ruled a North Sea empire encompassing Denmark, Norway and England until his death in 1035, levied a further massive payment known as the Heregeld, or the Army Geld, on a regular basis, institutionalizing what had begun as emergency tribute into something approaching a permanent tax that was simply part of the English fiscal landscape for years afterward. A rune stone still stands in the Swedish countryside at Yttergärde, carved in memory of a man named Ulf. The inscription says in the flat, memorial language of the runestones that Ulf took 3 gelds in England, 3 separate Danegeld payments. Ulf the Swede, whoever he was, whoever his family was, crossed the North Sea 3 times in the service of armies that made England pay, and came home 3 times with silver to show for it. The stone was raised by his sons after his death. Whether he died at home or abroad, the stone does not say. What it says is that he went and he was paid, and the payment was enough to be worth carving in stone. This was the silver economy from the outside, from the receiving end. But to understand what drove the men who crossed those seas and walked into those markets and cut those arm rings into hack silver on those portable bronze scales, you have to understand the tools, not the weapons. The tools, because the most diagnostic implement of the Viking Age trader-raider was not a sword. It was a folding balance, a small bronze or iron device that fitted neatly into a pouch or a shallow disc-shaped case with two bronze pans on fine chains that a man could take out of his belt at any market, in any town, in any part of the Norse world, from Dublin to Bulgar on the Volga, and use to weigh silver on the spot. You have already heard about these scales and about the hack silver they weighed, but it is worth pausing here in this middle register of Norse society to feel what that actually meant as a daily practice of commerce. When you arrived at the market at Hedeby or Birka with a cargo of furs or amber or the manufactured goods from your workshop, and you needed to pay for something, a quantity of iron, a length of cloth, a new pair of balance weights to replace the ones you wore out, the transaction did not proceed in the way a modern transaction proceeds. There was no shared unit of account whose face value both parties simply accepted. Instead, you reached into your pouch or cut a piece from the arm ring you were wearing, the plain silver penannular ring that was, among other things, a walking store of value, and the merchant across the table reached for his scales. He set the balance on whatever flat surface was available. He chose his weights from the set he carried, small, dense, oblate spheroids of iron with a bronze coating, or the faceted cubo-octahedral form that appears across the Rus and Baltic trade networks and represents something approaching a standardized international system of measurement. He placed the silver on one pan and weights on the other, and when the pans balanced, the transaction was complete. It was a system that worked as long as both parties trusted the weights and trusted that the silver was real. And this is where the test marks come in, the small nicks and punch marks that you find on coins and ingot fragments, and on the cut surfaces of arm rings in hoard after hoard, or what archaeologists call pecking, were how you checked that a piece of silver was what it claimed to be. A coin with an elaborate Arabic inscription and a properly formed edge might still be a silver-plated base metal disc worth almost nothing. A quick peck with a sharp point through the surface told you whether there was solid silver below. The clusters of peck marks on coins recovered from the Irish Sea region and the Danelaw are the material trace of 10,000 individual acts of commercial suspicion, each one a small test conducted in a market or a hall or a harbour, one man checking another man's claim, and the silver either passing or failing. The men who worked these markets and ran these river routes lived in a world where status and mobility were made of exactly this stuff, silver weighed and tested and cut and buried, and the most mobile of them, the men who chased the silver most aggressively and across the widest distances, were also the men who built and maintained and depended on the ships. The clinker-built longship is the most famous artifact of the Viking Age, and with reason. No other piece of technology defined the possibilities of the Norse world as completely as this ship. Clinker construction. The method of building a hull from overlapping planks, each one riveted to the one below it with iron rivets, creating a flexible skin that could flex and absorb the stresses of open water without breaking, was not invented by the Norse. Boat building in Northern Europe had been using variations on this technique for centuries before the Viking Age, but the Norse developed it to a point of refinement that produced vessels capable of things no earlier northern ship had managed. The hull of the clinker-built longship was shallow enough to be rowed up a river that a deeper draft vessel could not enter, shallow enough to be run directly onto a beach and dragged above the tide line without a harbour. And yet the same hull, fitted with a single large square sail and steered by the long oar fixed to the right-hand side of the stern. The steerboard, which is where the English word starboard comes from, the board on which the steering oar was mounted, was capable of crossing open ocean, the North Sea, the North Atlantic, the ice-fringed waters north of Scotland, the broad and dangerous stretch of water between Norway and Iceland. The flexibility of the hull was key to this. It was not a rigid box that would crack under stress. It was more like a woven basket designed to give and return, to move with the water rather than against it. Sailors who have crewed modern reconstructions of Viking ships describe the sensation of a longship in open water as unlike anything in modern sailing. The whole hull twists slightly with the waves, living and responsive, rather than the dead rigidity of a modern fiberglass hull. This aliveness was deliberate. It was engineered into the construction. The Oseberg ship, buried in a great mound in Norway around 834 and excavated in 1904, is the most beautifully preserved of the large Viking ships that have come down to us. She was built around 820, probably as a coastal and fjord vessel rather than an ocean-going ship. Her construction is more ornate than purely functional, with elaborate wood carving on the prow and stern. She was buried as a funerary monument, the vessel for a voyage into death, and the two women interred with her, at least one of whom was almost certainly of high status, possibly a queen, were accompanied by a richness of grave goods that speaks to extraordinary wealth and power. Sledges, a wagon, textiles of great quality, household equipment on a scale that suggests the intention of furnishing an afterlife. The Oseberg ship herself is roughly 22 meters long, and she is beautiful in the way that something made with absolute mastery of a craft is beautiful, every line considered, every joint tight. The Gotland ship, buried in the 890s and also in Norway, is a different kind of vessel. Where Oseberg is elegant and ceremonial, Gotland is robust and practical. She is roughly 23 to 24 meters long, deeper in the draft than Oseberg, with 16 pairs of oarsmen's rowing ports, and she was clearly built to go to sea in the open way. The high-status man buried with her, another figure of great importance, probably a regional chieftain, was accompanied by 3 smaller boats, 12 horses, 6 dogs, and the equipment of a man who expected his afterlife to be active. Replicas of the Gotland ship have crossed the Atlantic in modern times, demonstrating that vessels of this type could manage oceanic passages that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not seen them attempted. She is a working ship, and she is beautiful in the way that a well-made tool is beautiful, because every part of her does exactly what it is supposed to do. But the long ship, the Langskip, was only one face of Norse shipbuilding. The other face was the Nør, the cargo vessel, the workhorse of the Atlantic and the Baltic trade, where the Langskip was long and narrow and built for speed and for men. Its beam was perhaps a fifth of its length, and it sat so low in the water that you could trail your hand over the side. The Nør was broader and deeper, with a higher freeboard to keep cargo and seas apart, fewer oarsmen because you were not trying to sprint up a river or outrun a coast guard, and a larger, more powerful sail to do the work of moving a heavy load across open water. The Nør was the ship that carried colonists to Iceland and Greenland. It was the ship that carried the livestock and the tools and the supplies of a household moving to a new land. It was the ship that moved the bulk cargoes, the furs, the timber, the saltfish, the grain, that the trading emporia depended on. The Skulderev wrecks give us the best picture of this variety. In the 11th century, someone deliberately sank 5 ships in a narrow channel near Roskilde in Denmark to block an approach to the town, using old ships, worn-out ships, as a kind of disposable naval barrier. Those 5 ships lay in the mud of the Roskilde Fjord for nearly 1,000 years before they were excavated in the 1960s. When the waterlogged timbers were raised and studied, they turned out to represent 2 different vessel types: 2 warships, including 1 very large example, and 3 cargo vessels, including a fine Nør. The same fleet, the same economy, the 2 faces of the Norse world preserved in the same mud of the same fjord. And behind every sail that moved across the Norse sea lanes, there was a hidden economy that is easy to overlook, because the people who built it are not the people who figure most prominently in the chronicles or the sagas. The sail itself, the single great square of woven cloth that hung from the yard and drove the ship, was not a simple thing to make. A Viking sail for a medium-sized ship might measure something like 60 square meters of fabric. 60 square meters of tightly woven wool, strong enough to drive a loaded hull through a North Sea gale, was an enormous investment of labor. The wool alone, the raw fiber, before it had been washed and combed and spun and woven, came from the backs of hundreds of sheep. The spinning of that wool into thread and the weaving of that thread into fabric was measured not in days but in years of one person's work, or in months of many people's work, spread across the households of a community. This work was done by women, not entirely and not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. The keys and the spinning tools that appear together in women's graves, the jangling iron keys of a housewife's authority over the stores and the household, the paired weights from a warp-weighted loom, the spindle whirls that allow you to date a grave almost precisely from their style, are the material record of an economy of fiber production that was as essential to the Norse world as the iron production that made the weapons. Without the wool and the women who processed it, there were no sails. Without sails, there were no crossings. Without crossings, there were no raids and no trades. The whole visible, masculine, heroic economy of the Viking Age floated, quite literally, on a foundation of women's textile labor. The sail's hidden arithmetic went further. The sheep whose wool became the sail had to be grazed on land, fed through the winter, shorn each spring. The land had to be held and farmed. The household that produced the wool had to be sustained through the long Norwegian or Icelandic winter on the stored food of the previous summer's farming. The ship and the expedition it enabled were the visible tip of an agricultural and domestic pyramid that extended all the way back through the household economy to the soil and the animals and the hands of the people, men and women, both, who worked it. This is the world of the craftsman and the builder, not a separate world from the farmer and the trader, but the same world with different hands doing different parts of the same work. The blacksmith at Hedeby forging iron ship fittings was part of the same system as the woman at her loom in a farmstead in western Norway, spinning the wool that would become the sail that would carry those fittings to their destination. The comb maker shaping antler at his bench in Birka was connected to the trader-raider who would carry his finished combs east on the Volga route and exchange them for the dirhams that would eventually end up buried in one of those 700 Gotland hoards. No part of this world was separate from any other part. The silver that threaded through all of it was the medium of connection, the thing that translated a farmer's surplus into a trader's cargo into a lord's gift into a warrior's loyalty into a king's power. And the craftsmen who worked the silver itself, the smiths who hammered the ingots into arm rings, who cut the hack silver into payment fragments, who sometimes worked dirhams or other foreign coins into pendants or brooches as both ornament and portable wealth, were participants in the economy at a level that was difficult to define cleanly on the social ladder. A skilled smith might work for a jarl or a king, might be given land and status in return for his service, might travel widely in the employment of powerful men. The tools of his trade were themselves a form of portable capital. A set of smithing tools found in a grave, the tongs and the hammers and the punches, was the equivalent of a craftsman's pension fund, the material proof of a skill that could be exchanged for silver in any town on the trade routes. The traders and the craftsmen and the builders of ships occupied a middle space in Norse society that was defined less by birth than by skill and by mobility, by the ability to move through the network and to convert things into silver and silver back into things. A man who was born a carl, a free farmer on a modest land holding, but who had the skill to build ships or the courage to take them east, on the river routes, or west to England with an army, was a man who could change his position in the world. Not easily, and not without risk. The rune stones of the men who went east and did not come back are a constant reminder of what the eastern routes cost. But the possibility was there, woven into the structure of the economy in a way that made the Norse world, at its commercial heart, more porous and more dynamic than the blood and honor ideology of the sagas sometimes suggests. Silver was the solvent. It dissolved, or at least softened, the boundaries between the rungs of the ladder. It could not make a thrall free. Only the formal act of manumission could do that. Only the freedom ale and the legal ceremony of the leisingi. But it could make a carl wealthy enough to command the kind of respect at the assembly that put him closer to a jarl than to his neighbors. It could make a craftsman famous enough that great men competed for his service. It could make a trader's name known on every waterway between the Baltic and the Caspian. And the men who accumulated it in the greatest quantities, who buried it in the ground in moments of fear or uncertainty or ritual necessity, and who sometimes did not come back to reclaim it. Those men and the silver they left behind are the buried pulse of the whole Viking age, still being found in the earth of islands and fields and riverbeds 1,000 years on, still waiting for the hand that pressed it down and never returned. And so we come to the upper rungs of the ladder. Not the top yet. That is still a little further up. But to the men whose names the Skalds remembered, whose halls were long and firelit and full of armed companions, whose arm rings were famous enough that cutting them apart was an act of theatre as much as an act of payment. The Jarl was not in the first instance a king. He was something more complicated than that, and in some ways more interesting. A regional magnate, a war leader, a man who had accumulated enough silver and enough loyal swords to hold a district or a coastline or a collection of islands by the force of his presence and the weight of his gifts. In Norway, the Jarls of Lade, a great estate near what is now Trondheim, were powerful enough at their height to govern whole regions of the country and to stand as genuine rivals to kings rather than merely their servants. The title Jarl is the same word, worn down through Old English, that became the English Earl. But in the Norse world it carried a weight that the later English earldom does not quite capture, because the Jarl in his prime was not a creature of a king's patronage, but a force in his own right, a man around whom the gravitational field of power organized itself. And what held that gravitational field together was the hall. Imagine a long timber-built structure, its walls thick, its roof high enough that the smoke from the central hearth has somewhere to drift before it finds the smoke hole above. The floor is beaten earth or laid stone, covered with rushes or straw or the skins of animals. Down the length of it the benches run on either side, and the men who sit on those benches are not guests in the way we might think of guests. They are huskarlar, housecarls, members of the Lord's herd, his household retinue, and their presence in this hall is the physical expression of an arrangement that is simultaneously military, economic, and almost contractual in its clarity. The Lord feeds them, he houses them, he arms them. The sword at a warrior's belt may well have come from the Lord's hand as a gift, and the cloak on his back and the arm ring he wears, and in return those men fight for him, follow him, and add their numbers and their reputation to his. The Lord's power is, in quite a literal sense, the sum of these men. This is the herd, and the bond that holds it together is the gift. The gift in Viking society was not the same thing as a gift in the way we usually mean it, a generous act, freely given, carrying no particular obligation. A gift in the Norse world was a social mechanism, a way of creating a bond and simultaneously demonstrating that you were capable of creating one, that you had enough surplus, enough silver, enough of everything, to give some of it away. The anthropologists have a term for economies like this, gift economies, in which the exchange of goods creates relationships and obligations rather than simply transferring property. And the Norse world operated on a gift economy at the highest levels of its social life, even as it operated on a very precisely calibrated bullion economy in its markets. The two systems were not separate, they were the same system operating at different registers. The silver that changed hands on a balance scale in the market at Hedeby was the same silver that flowed from a lord's hand to his warrior's wrist in the form of an arm ring at a feast. The difference was the context and the relationship it was meant to create. The single most praised quality in a great lord, in the vocabulary of skaldic poetry, was generosity, and the skalds, those professional poets who were themselves a feature of the upper rungs of Norse society, men paid in silver and arm rings to compose formal praise poetry in complex meters for the men who could afford their services. The skalds had a name for the most generous kind of lord, Baugbroti, ring breaker, breaker of rings, and alongside that, Shringbroti, same meaning, the lord who breaks his rings apart. Think about what that phrase is actually describing. An arm ring of silver, Bulgar rings, were both worn on the arm and carried as a store of value, as we have already come to understand, was a visible emblem of wealth, a thing beautiful enough to wear at a feast and weighty enough to function as bullion when circumstances required. For a lord to take such a ring from his own arm or from the chest where his silver was stored and break it, cut it, bend it, chop a piece from it, was to take something that expressed his wealth and deliberately fragment it in order to give the pieces to his men. The ring giver was not merely generous, he was performing generosity in its most economically legible form, taking his own silver jewelry apart and distributing the pieces. And the skald was there to make sure everyone knew it, to compose the verse that would carry the Lord's name and his open-handedness forward into the future, into the mouths of men who had not been in that hall on that evening. The skald himself occupied an interesting position in this world. He was a craftsman of a particular and highly valued kind, the craftsman of reputation, the man who could make a lord's name immortal, or if he chose, make it into something to be ashamed of. The Havamal, that collection of Eddic wisdom poetry, puts the underlying principle with the kind of bluntness that wisdom poetry favors. Der fe, deja frender, der schalfer it summer. Cattle die, kinsmen die, the self dies in the same way. En ord stier der aldregi. But a good reputation never dies. The immortality that mattered in the Norse world was not the immortality of the body, but the immortality of the name, and the skald was its custodian. A lord who wanted his name to outlast him paid for the poem that would carry it. The skald who composed in the elaborate, allusion-dense meters of skaldic verse, meters so intricate that even trained scholars spend years learning to decode them, was paid in arm rings, in weapons, in horses. His compensation was itself an act of ring-giving. The economy of reputation and the economy of silver were, at this level, completely entangled. When you sat in the Great Hall as a member of the Lord's Herd, your position on the bench encoded your rank. The hall was not a democracy. The Undvegi, the high seat, the seat of honor, was the Lord's seat, placed at the center of the hall on the raised dais or simply in the most prominent position along one of the long walls. To be seated near the high seat was to be close to power. To be seated at the far end of the hall near the door was to be at the margin of the Lord's circle. When visitors arrived, the question of where they were seated was a statement about how the Lord regarded them. When the mead horn came around, and it came around in a specific order, not randomly, the sequence in which people drank expressed the hierarchy of the room. These were not accidents of seating, they were deliberate, legible communication in a language everyone in the hall understood. And into this world came the feast itself, the drinking, the recitation of poetry, the telling of stories, the competitive exchange of boasts and oaths that the saga literature sometimes records, the presentation of gifts. A feast in a great hall was not mere eating and drinking. It was a performance of the social order, a renewal of the bonds between the Lord and his men, a display of wealth and competence, and the Lord's ability to provide. A Lord who could not feast his men well, who ran short of mead, or whose hall was cold, or whose gifts were meagre, was a Lord whose hold on his men's loyalty was loosening. The feast was the mechanism by which the herd was maintained. And outside the hall, outside the circle of the Lord's fire and the Lord's gifts, there was the wider world, and the institution that made it legible, that gave it its laws and its procedures, and its means of settling the disputes that would otherwise end in blood. The Thing. The Thing. The Thing was an assembly of free men, and in that phrase, free men, lies the whole of its significance. Because the Thing was not open to everyone. The thrall who slept in the long house, who carried his owner's goods and butchered his owner's animals, and had no legal personhood of his own, had no place at the Thing. He could not speak there, could not vote there, had no standing to bring a case or answer one on his own behalf. The Thing was for the free, and being free, having the right to stand at the Thing and speak and be heard, was one of the clearest possible markers of the difference between the bottom rungs of the ladder and the rungs above. The Thing existed at multiple levels. There were local things, district things, and then the larger regional assemblies, the Gulathing and the Frostathing in Norway, gatherings that drew free men from across wide territories to settle disputes, pass laws, and conduct the public business of a society that had no bureaucracy, no standing courts, no police force, no judges in the modern sense. Law in the Norse world was oral. It was memorized. It was held in the mind of a single specialist, the løgsøgumadrets, the law speaker, literally the one who speaks the law, whose function was to carry the law in his memory and recite it aloud to the assembly so that everyone present could hear it and know it. He was a living library, a walking legal code, and his accuracy was the foundation on which justice rested. In Iceland, this institution reached a form that is remarkable enough to be worth dwelling on. The Icelandic Alþingi, Alþing, was founded around the year 930 at a place called Þingvellir, the Assembly Plains, a broad flat valley formed by the rift between tectonic plates where the earth has literally pulled itself apart over millions of years, leaving a landscape of lava fields and clear, cold rivers and the great rift wall that rose like a natural stage above the plain. The Alþing met at Þingvellir every summer, drawing free men from across the island, and it functioned as both a legislature and a court, the supreme institution of a society that had, in an arrangement almost unique in the medieval world, no king. Iceland had been settled by Norse colonists from roughly 870 onward, many of them, according to tradition, men and families who had left Norway precisely because they did not want to live under Harald Fairhair, The king, who was in the process of consolidating power over Norway and bringing the independent chieftains under something more like royal authority. The Icelanders had come to a place beyond kings, and they had built a society around the thing rather than around a throne. Their chieftains were Godard, goddess, a title that combined something like a chieftaincy with a kind of priestly or civic function. And the Godar competed with each other for influence and followers, but none of them was king. At the center of the Althing stood the Lögberg, the law rock. This was the place from which the law speaker spoke. Standing on or near the law rock, he recited a third of the laws aloud each year, which meant the whole legal code passed through the public air over the course of 3 years, heard by every free man who attended. This was not a written constitution filed away in an archive. This was law as sound as breath, as the spoken voice of one man carrying the agreement of a whole society in his mind and giving it back to that society year after year. The law speaker served for a term of 3 years, precisely long enough to recite everything once. And it was at the Althing, around the year 999 or 1000, that one of the most consequential decisions in Icelandic history was made. Decided not by a king, not by a bishop, but by the thing itself, by the assembled free men of Iceland in the way they decided everything, by vote and negotiation and the judgment of the law speaker. Christianity had been spreading in Iceland, brought by returning travellers and by the influence of the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, who had been pressing the Icelanders to convert. There were Christians in Iceland already, and pagans, and the tension between them had reached a point where the Althing faced the possibility of serious civil conflict, even war, between the two groups. The question of which religion Iceland would follow was put to the law speaker of the time, a man named Thorgeir Ljósvetningagodi, Thorgeir of the Ljósavatten district, who was himself still a pagan. He withdrew to his booth, lay down under his cloak, and spent an entire day and night in silence. And then he rose and delivered his judgment. Iceland would become Christian, one people under one law. Both sides made concessions. Certain pagan practices could continue in private for a time, but the formal decision was made and it held. This is the thing as it could be at its best, a mechanism for making collective decisions in a society without a sovereign, for absorbing conflict and converting it into law rather than blood. It did not always work so cleanly. The sagas are full of things that went wrong, of feuds that the thing could not contain, of men who would not accept a judgment and took their grievance back into the landscape to settle with swords. But the institution itself, the idea that free men could gather and speak and decide together, was robust enough to persist across centuries and across the ocean, and the Althing at Thingvellir is often counted among the oldest surviving parliamentary institutions in the world. The penalties the thing could impose ran a spectrum. For many offences, the appropriate resolution was compensation. Vergild, the man price, paid in silver to the victim's kin. A killing could be settled by payment, the amount scaled to the rank and standing of the dead. And since the law codes preserved in the Gragas and in the Norwegian codes denominated those payments in area and merk, in the silver weight units of the bullion economy, the thing and the hack-silver economy were connected at their foundations. A death had a price, and that price was weighed silver. At the far end of the spectrum for the most serious violations, killing at the assembly itself, or crimes so grave that no compensation was deemed sufficient, the thing could impose outlawry. Skoganga, going to the forest. The full outlaw was expelled from the community in a way that was, in its own terms, the most complete form of social death short of physical death. He lost his property. He lost his legal standing. He lost the protection of the law entirely. Any free man who encountered a full outlaw could kill him without consequence, without vergildode, without legal redress of any kind. The outlaw became, in the eyes of the law, a creature outside it, like an animal in the forest, without rights, without recourse. The word skuganga literally means forest walking, and the image is exact. The man expelled from the assembly, from the hall, from the farm, reduced to the woods and the wilderness, beyond the boundary of the human world. There was also lesser outlawry, which imposed exile for a fixed term, 3 years typically, rather than the permanent expulsion of the full outlaw. Lesser outlaws could return. They had not entirely forfeited their humanity, but the mechanism of outlawry was a demonstration of how deeply the thing went in its power. It could not hang you. The Norse were not great hangers, and formal execution was relatively rare in this period, but it could make you killable, and that was often enough. One more voice needs to be heard at the thing, or rather noted in its absence from the formal record of who could speak and vote, and that is the voice of women. A free woman in the Norse world occupied a position that was, by the standards of the medieval period broadly, relatively notable. She could own property, she could inherit under defined circumstances, she could initiate a divorce, and the Old Norse laws on divorce are explicit enough about the grounds and the procedures that the right was genuinely exercised, not merely theoretical. She managed the household in her husband's absence, and the symbol of that authority was carried at her belt, the keys to the chests and the stores, to the supply of the household. In the graves of high-status Norse women, the iron and bronze key sets often hung from the elaborate paired brooches that fastened their outer garments are among the most consistent grave goods. The woman of the household literally wearing her authority in metal, making it visible in the same way that a warrior's weapons or a lord's armouring made other kinds of authority visible. But she could not speak at the thing. She could not hold formal legal or political office in her own right. She was free, and her freedom was genuine and meaningful. It was not the same thing as a thrall's legal non-existence, but it stopped at the threshold of the assembly. The thing was, in its formal structure, a gathering of free men, and the word men there was not metaphorical. This is the world as it was, more capacious than the picture sometimes painted, and more constrained than it might be flattering to pretend. And above all of it, above the free farmer on his land, above the trader on his river route, above the craftsman in his workshop, above the jarl in his hall and his hired, sat the king, or rather began to sit. Because one of the things that the early Viking age shows you, if you watch it carefully, is a world in the process of becoming a world of kings. The king, the konunga, was not a settled feature of Norse society from the beginning. There were always men who called themselves kings, or who were called kings by others, petty kings, regional kings, kings of this island or that valley, but the consolidation of real, durable royal power over large territories was a process of the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, not a given from the start. Harold Fairhair, Harold Halfagree, Harold of the Fair Hair, is the figure around whom Norse tradition organized the story of Norway's unification. The dates are uncertain, the sources are later, and the sagas are not to be read as straightforward history. But the tradition holds that Harold fought his way to dominance over the other petty kings of Norway over the course of the late 9th century, that he won a decisive naval battle at Hafrsfjord, and that the chieftains who would not submit to him left. Some of them, the tradition says, all the way to Iceland, founding a colony beyond his reach. Whether or not the details are precisely as the sagas tell it, the trajectory is real. Over the course of this period, Norway was moving towards something more recognizable as a unified kingdom, even if that unification remained contested and unstable for generations. In Denmark, the clearest single monument to royal power in the Viking Age, stands at a place called Jelling in central Jutland. It stands there still, two massive burial mounds, a church that replaced an earlier pagan structure, and two rune stones. The larger of the rune stones was raised by Harald Bluetooth, Harald Blåtand, King of Denmark in the mid to late 10th century, and its inscription is one of the most ambitious pieces of royal self-presentation in the Viking world. It records in runes that Harald won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. 3 claims on a single stone, territorial dominion over 2 kingdoms, and religious conversion. The Jelling stone has been called Denmark's birth certificate, the moment at which a king in stone announced that he was a king, that his kingdom was a thing, and that it had a new faith. Harald Bluetooth's conversion of the Danes to Christianity was not a purely spiritual act. It was also a political one. A Christian king could deal with the Christian kingdoms of Europe as an equal, could negotiate with the Holy Roman Emperor, could position himself within the framework of European power that was organized around the church. The great carved rune stone at Jelling, with its image of Christ entangled in the Nordic knotwork that the stonecutter could not quite leave behind, is a piece of political communication as much as a religious one. And the mounds behind it, one the burial mound of Harald's father Gorm, the other empty, the body perhaps moved into the new church, are the pagan past standing just behind the Christian present, visible and acknowledged but repositioned. How did a king fund all of this? The hall, the herd, the runestones, the building programs, tribute, taxation, and the control of trade. The Leidanger was the naval levy, the system by which a king could call on coastal districts to provide ships, men, and provisions for the royal fleet. Each district had an obligation, defined in the law codes, to outfit and crew a ship of specified size when the king called for it. This was not a request. It was a legal duty, and the law codes are explicit about the penalties for failure to comply. The Leidanger transformed the kingdom's coastline into a military asset that the king could mobilize, and it meant that royal power was, quite literally, measured in ships. A king who could call up dozens of longships was a different kind of king than one who could call up 10. And the great trading emporia, Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang, Ribe, were not simply markets that happened to exist. They existed at the intersection of trade routes that generated tolls, fees, and silver, and the kings who controlled those locations controlled the flows of wealth that moved through them. To hold Hedeby at the neck of the Jutland Peninsula, where the routes between the Baltic and the North Sea converged, was to hold a choke point of the Norse commercial world. The silver that came through Hedeby could be taxed, and the taxes funded the king's power, and the king's power secured the market, and the market generated more silver. It was a system that fed itself as long as the king was strong enough to hold the center. And sometimes the kings built things that announced their strength in the most unmistakable possible terms. The Danevirke, the Dane work, was a series of defensive earthwork fortifications across the base of the Jutland Peninsula, the line where Scandinavia meets the European continent. Parts of it were ancient, but it was extended and reinforced significantly under the Danish kings, a massive construction project that required organized labor, sustained logistics, and royal authority capable of directing both. You cannot build a wall across a peninsula by accident. You need a king. And then there are the Trelleborg fortresses, a set of precisely geometric ring fortresses built in Denmark around the year 980 during Harald Bluetooth's reign. Trelleborg itself on the island of Sjælland, Agersborg in northern Jutland, the largest of them, Firkat, Nonnebakken under what is now the city of Odense. 4 fortresses, all built to the same plan, a perfect circle of earthen rampart, a precise diameter, the interior divided into 4 quadrants by streets intersecting at right angles, each quadrant filled with long houses arranged in a square around an open courtyard. The geometry is so exact that when archaeologists first uncovered the Trelleborg plan, some of them initially struggled to believe it was Norse rather than Roman. The Trelleborg fortresses are not the work of raiding warlords. They are the work of a state, or something moving rapidly toward being a state, with the organizational capacity to design identical fortresses, build them simultaneously in multiple locations, and populate them with soldiers drawn from a military system capable of this kind of coordination. What they were for is still debated. Barracks for an army preparing a major campaign, control points for the collection of tribute, a demonstration of royal authority visible and undeniable to anyone who approached? Perhaps all of these at once, but they stand as the clearest single demonstration in the archaeological record of what it meant to be a Viking Age king at the height of his power. Not simply a lord with a larger hall and more warriors, but a ruler with the capacity to reshape the physical landscape in proof of his reach. Knut the Great, Knuta in Riki, represented the furthest extent of this trajectory. In the early 11th century, Knut ruled a North Sea empire, Denmark, England, and for a time Norway, a dominion that stretched from the Baltic to the borders of Scotland and encompassed more people and more silver than any Norse king before him. He governed England not as a conqueror camping in a foreign land, but as a king, issuing laws, patronizing churches, attending councils, moving between the mechanisms of power with a fluency that tells you something about how far the Norse world had traveled from the chieftains of the longhouses. Knut was a king in the fullest European sense, which is to say that the distance between the thrall sleeping in the longhouse and the man at the top of the ladder was not just a distance of silver and swords, but of an entirely different way of organizing the world. And yet the silver thread ran through all of it. The king's power was still ultimately a power of silver, the tribute he collected, the Danegeld he had once received, and then, as King of England, levied himself as a permanent tax, called the Heregeld. The Leidanga was funded in silver, the Herd was maintained by gifts of silver, the Skald was paid in silver, the Vergild that made the law run was silver. The Trelleborg fortresses were built by men who expected to be compensated in silver or its equivalent. From the arm ring on the lowest warrior's wrist to the treasure chest at the back of the king's hall, it was all the same thing, silver, weighed and measured and given and received and buried and sometimes, in the moments of fear or flight or violent uncertainty that punctuate the history of this period, left in the ground. The hoards. The buried hoards are the Viking Age's most intimate testimony, and the largest of them can stop you completely if you let yourself think about what they represent. The Spillings Hoard, found on Gotland in 1999. Over 67 kilograms of silver, 67 kilograms, a weight you could not comfortably lift with one hand, the equivalent of roughly 1,000 arm rings. Buried in a farmer's field on an island in the Baltic Sea and not recovered for approximately 1,000 years. More than 14,000 coins, most of them Islamic dirhams minted in the workshops of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Central Asian mints at Samarkand and Tashkent, alongside a separate large bronze hoard. The coins alone tell the story of the entire Eastern trade network in miniature. This silver left the Islamic world, travelled north along the Volga and the other river routes, passed through the hands of Russ's traders and Norse merchants, and perhaps a slave market or two along the way, crossed the Baltic and came to rest in the hands of whoever buried it at Spillings. Someone who had reason to hide it, who intended to come back, and who did not. The Cuerdala hoard, found in Lancashire in England in 1840 near the banks of the River Ribble, approximately 40 kilograms of silver, some 8,600 objects, mostly hack silver, and dirhams and ingots, and fragmentary arm rings, buried around 905 to 910 in what was then the Danelaw. the part of England under Norse legal and cultural influence. 40 kilograms of silver chopped into pieces, representing the treasury of someone, a war leader perhaps, or a merchant syndicate, or a group of soldiers disbanding after a campaign, who hid it and never retrieved it. The circumstances of its burial can only be guessed at: a sudden threat, a death on the road, a miscalculation. The hoard does not say. It only says, we were here, we had this silver, and then we were not here anymore. Gotland alone, that island in the Baltic, that sat at the intersection of the eastern and western trade routes like a toll booth at the center of the Norse commercial world, has yielded more than 700 Viking-age silver hoards. 700. In an island that at its longest is about 170 kilometers. The concentration is so dense that the earth there is, in some sense, still full of the Viking age, still holding the buried savings of people who never came back. The Havamal understood something about this. That collection of Eddic wisdom verse, attributed to Odin and addressed to the man trying to navigate the world, knew that cattle die and kinsmen die and the self dies in the same way. And so the only thing worth pursuing, the only thing that could outlast the body and the farm and the silver buried in the field, was the name. En Odstyr der Aldregi. But a good reputation never dies. The honor economy that sat above the silver economy, the world of the skald and the ring giver and the saga and the rune stone, was the Norse attempt to make something permanent in a world where everything else was movable and perishable and vulnerable to exactly the kind of loss that left those hoards in the ground. Think about the rune stones in Sweden that record men who went to England and took Danegeld, who received, that is, a share of the silver that England paid Norse armies to go away. The Yttergarda stone, which records that a man named Ulf took 3 separate gelds in England, 3 separate payments of tribute in 3 separate campaigns. It is a boast in stone. I was there, I was paid, I survived. The rune stone is the receipt, the permanent record, the reputation that Ulf bought with his years away from home and his willingness to cross a winter sea. And then there are the Ingvar runestones in Sweden, more than 24 of them raised for the men who went east on an expedition led by Ingvar the far-travelled, and did not come back, men whose names their families carved in stone, so that the reputation, at least, would not be buried with the body wherever it had fallen, somewhere along the rivers of the east. This is the full sweep of the ladder. At the bottom, a person who was not legally a person, i.e. who was property, chattel, a commodity, moving between the markets of Dublin and the slave markets at Bulgar on the Volga, whose death was not a murder but property damage, whose life could be ended to accompany a master into the fire of a ship cremation on the banks of a river in the east. Above that, the freedman, the Leisingi, working his way through stages of legal personhood that might take generations to complete. Above that, the Carl, the Bondi, the free farmer, the backbone of the whole thing. The man who grew the barley and raised the cattle and held the assembly rights and paid his weregild fines in silver and never in his life stepped onto a ship going anywhere dangerous, who was nonetheless the demographic reality of the Viking age, the overwhelming majority of the people who lived it. Above him, the craftsman who might work in the town at Hedeby or Birka and whose skill might carry him further than his birth suggested. Above him, the trader-raider who followed the silver, east to the Caliphate's edge, west to England with an army, wherever the exchange rate was most favorable this season, and who carried his folding balance scale in his kit because money here was still something you weighed rather than counted. Above him, the Jarl in his hall, breaking his rings, feeding his warriors, paying his scald, holding his high seat while the mead went around in the right order. And above even that, the king, the Konungrushgyas, writing his ambitions in rune-carved stone and earthwork fortifications, and the legal machinery of the naval levy, turning a society of farmers and traders into something that looked, by the time Nut stood in it, remarkably like a state. All of it organized around the same question, asked at every rung: how much silver can you weigh and give away and bury, and sometimes lose forever in the dark? The silver that they buried and never reclaimed is still out there. Fields on Gotland still give it up when a plough goes deep enough, or a detector sweeps at the right angle on a still morning. The earth has been holding it for 1,000 years, patient in the way that only earth can be. And somewhere below the surface of an island or a field or a riverbank that nobody has yet thought to look at carefully, there is probably another Spillings Hoard or something close to it. 67 kilograms of the Viking age compressed into a ceramic pot or a wooden box long since rotted away to nothing. The silver still there, the dirhams still bearing the names of caliphs who ruled from Baghdad, still carrying the weight units of a system that connected a longhouse on a Scandinavian fjord to the markets of the Abbasid world, and back again. All of it lost. All of it waiting. The hand that pressed it down and never returned has been gone for 1,000 years, but the silver remembers the weight of it. This is what it was, to live at every level of Viking society. A world held together by portable, weighable wealth and by the reputation you could build around it, where the distance between the bottom and the top was measured not in blood alone, but in silver, in the arm rings you could give away, and the ones you had to chop apart to make change, in whether you owned yourself and whether your name would outlast you. Where a man could, in the right circumstances, move between the rungs, and not easily, never easily, but with a reality that the ideology of noble blood preferred not to advertise. Where the same ship that traded in one port raided the next, and the same silver that left the Islamic mints in Central Asia might end up on the wrist of a Norwegian jarl who would eventually break it into pieces and hand those pieces to the men sitting on the benches of his hall on a firelit winter evening. The fire in that hall has been out for a long time, but if you lie still in the dark tonight and let the weight of this settle, you can almost hear the sound the scale makes. That small, precise metallic settling as the silver finds its balance, as the pans come level, as the weight is declared, and the transaction is complete, and two men on opposite sides of a market stall, somewhere between Hedeby and the edge of the known world, nod at each other and agree on what things are worth. Somewhere on an island in the Baltic, 67 kilograms of that agreement are still in the ground. Quiet now. Let the old world recede. If you find yourself here often, settling into these long, slow journeys through the deep past, there are more waiting for you here, more slow descents into the things that were buried and are still being uncovered. And if you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there and I read them. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.